First of all, I think before we talk about main ingredients of whiskey, we have to kind of look at where's the whiskey from, because a lot of times that's going to dictate what they use and also what it's called. So since we're in the U.S., we'll start there first. So in the U.S., a lot of people are familiar with bourbon. Well, one of the things to be a bourbon is it actually has to be made in the U.S. A lot of people are confused because they think that it has to be made in Kentucky, which it doesn't. It just happens to be that about 95% of all of our bourbon is made in Kentucky. But bourbon can be made anywhere in the U.S. So the main ingredients for a bourbon is that it's got to be at least 51% corn. And the other ingredients are typically rye, barley, and wheat. So most of the time, if it's a bourbon, it'll be, if it's a regular bourbon, it'll be corn, barley, and rye. And if you get a wheated bourbon, then obviously you're substituting the rye with wheat. And that just gives it more of a softer tones. So that's kind of what you get. And then the differences between one bourbon to another might be that one has more corn in it, or one has more rye in it, or whatnot. And all of them, for the most part, the barley is in there really just for helping the germination process to create the sugars from the starch. So that's really just to get the yeast going, but for the most part you're looking at corn, whether it has rye in it or if it has wheat in it, and barley. So that's for bourbon. And of course, if you're talking about a rye, it would be the same thing, but the rye and the corn kind of switch places. So that's as far as the makeup of what makes a bourbon versus over here and across the pond, a scotch. Now, single malt scotch is all malted barley. They use one ingredient, they distill it, and then they age it. So there's a variety of differences in where the scotch is made, but again, to be a scotch, it has to come from Scotland. So that's kind of a very high-level look at what makes a scotch or a bourbon and whatnot. But again, the main ingredient, barley, and over here you have corn, barley, wheat, and rye.